The girl was found in her own bedroom. Only 31 years later, everyone learned the shocking truth. It all started when a 16-year-old girl was found dead in her own bedroom. The police were immediately suspicious and realized they were dealing with a murder. But none of her relatives heard anything that night. It was a complete mystery, and the case went unsolved for 31 long years. That is until the shocking truth was finally revealed. What was it that the investigators found out after all those years? How did they manage to crack the case? And why did it take so long to solve this gruesome murder? This video will answer all these questions, so stick around for the shocking conclusion that will leave you speechless. We all have a story, a past that shapes who we are today. Fawn Cox was no exception. Born on March 24, 1973, in Kansas City, Missouri. She was the oldest of 3 daughters. Growing up, Fawn helped her parents take care of her younger sisters and enjoyed swimming in her free time. She was a devoted churchgoer and had a bright future ahead of her. But fate had a different plan in store. Despite coming from a family with financial struggles, Fawn was determined to make the most of her life. When she turned 16, Fawn got a part-time job at a local amusement park. She spent most of her summer vacations in 1989 working behind the cash register, selling tickets to amusement rides. It was a typical job for a teenager, but for Fawn, it was a way to help support her family. On July 26, 1989, Fawn finished her shift at the amusement park and was picked up by her mother and younger sister. They arrived home late that night. Fawn went straight to bed, exhausted from a long day of work. But little did she know, it would be her last night alive. Fawn's sisters typically slept in the room next to hers, but she was alone on the second floor that night. Her sister Amber was babysitting for a family friend, and her other sister Felicia decided to sleep on the first floor where it was cooler. It was a hot summer night, and the only air conditioner that worked was downstairs, where their parents also slept. The details of that night are chilling. What happened in Fawn's bedroom while she slept peacefully? The events of that fateful night are harrowing, and the aftermath was just as devastating. The whole family woke up to the sound of the alarm clock in Fawn's room, but she didn't turn it off for some reason. Concerned, her younger sister and mother went up to her room and found a sight that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. Fawn lay on the bed, lifeless and with visible bruises on her neck. She had no pulse, and her parents immediately called an ambulance, but it was too late. Fawn had passed away hours before, and there was nothing anyone could do to bring her back. The cause of death was determined to be strangulation, and Fawn had also suffered from abuse. It was a brutal and senseless act that left everyone in shock and disbelief. The police knew from the first hours that they had a challenging investigation ahead of them. Despite being killed in her own bedroom, nobody in the house heard anything. But there was a reason for this. The air conditioner on the first floor was old and incredibly loud, drowning out any other noise in the house. However, one strange behavior caught the attention of Fawn's sister. Their poodle was acting anxious and barking, which was unusual behavior for the usually calm and well-behaved dog. At the time, they didn't pay much attention to it, attributing it to the fact the dog was pregnant. But in hindsight, it's clear that the poodle may have sensed something was wrong and was trying to alert the family. After examining the scene, the police made several important discoveries that would eventually lead them to the killer. The police believed the attacker or group had entered the house through a second-story window overlooking the backyard. This window had been left open because there was no air conditioning on the second floor, and one had to fight the heat somehow. The details of the crime scene are chilling, and it's clear that the perpetrator or perpetrators knew what they were doing. There was an old trailer parked near the house that could easily be used to climb up to the canopy of the outbuilding, which was almost level with the window. It was a calculated and deliberate act that would leave everyone questioning who could have been capable of such a heinous crime. As the investigation into Fawn Cox's murder continued, experts found several essential clues in her bedroom, ultimately leading to the shocking truth. They discovered a few short hairs, small blood stains, and traces of semen on the sheet from her bed. All of this was sent to the lab for analysis, and it was just the beginning of a long and complex investigation. In addition, several items were missing from the house, including radios, a Nintendo game console, and a stereo recorder. But what was even more curious was the fact that several other items were found on the ground in front of the house. It looked as if the burglar had thrown them out the window to take them with him, but left them there for some reason. As detectives delved deeper into the investigation, they found that various items had been removed from a closet in an adjoining room on the second floor. It was a chilling discovery. They believed that the perpetrator was hiding in that closet while waiting for everyone in the house to go to sleep. Normally, Fawn's sister slept in that room, but not that night. For this reason, no one noticed the items on display. As the investigation into Fawn Cox murder continued, the police discovered another strange clue. An old army cap was found in Fawn's room. None of her relatives have seen her wearing it before, so detectives assume the killer might have forgotten the cap at the scene. It was a curious detail, but it would ultimately lead to an important breakthrough in the case. Despite the impressive array of evidence, the police were unable to identify any suspects quickly. In 1989, DNA forensics was relatively underdeveloped, and there were no common genetic databases at that time. It was a challenging investigation, but Detective Benjamin Caldwell was determined to get to the bottom of it. In his opinion, there could have been several assailants, and they must have known the house well. Not only did they know how to get to the second floor through the backyard in total darkness, but they must have also known the layout of the rooms. It was a chilling thought. Someone had been watching the family for some time, waiting for the right moment to strike. Now, as the next step, the police began to look for witnesses who could provide valuable information about the crime. They interviewed Fawn's neighbors, friends, and relatives, but all of their leads were inconclusive. It seemed as though the killer had vanished without a trace. But the detectives had one weighty problem before them. The neighborhood in which the house was located was impoverished and criminal. Various criminal gangs separated there, and their participants were quite tricky to bring to justice. It was challenging to work in, but the detectives remained determined to bring Fawn's killer to justice. After a month of frustration and dead ends, the investigation into Fawn Cox's murder finally got off the ground. The police received a tip from a witness who pointed them to 3 suspects, all of them teenagers, one of whom was in the same class as Fawn. It was a promising lead, and the detectives were determined to get to the bottom of it. This witness knew a number of important details that the police had never divulged, so his story was taken seriously. The suspects were quickly apprehended and questioned, but the boys denied involvement in the murder. The case of Fawn Cox's murder seemed to be coming together as the police found items stolen from a room in one of the suspects' homes. The evidence was enough to charge all 3 of them with murder, but as the investigation progressed, the detectives were left feeling disappointed. Their main witness suddenly recanted and stopped cooperating with the police, leaving the detectives to wonder why. Was the witness afraid of retaliation, or were they hiding something? It was a frustrating setback for the detectives, who had relied heavily on the witness's information to build their case. And then there was the issue of DNA analysis. In those years, experts could not establish an exact match of the samples, and all their tests showed questionable results. The analysis could not confirm either a full match or a guaranteed mismatch. It was a blow to the investigation, as the detectives had hoped that the DNA evidence would be the final piece of the puzzle that would tie the suspects to the crime. Despite these setbacks, the detectives continued to work tirelessly to unravel the secrets behind Fawn's murder. And then, a glimmer of hope. One of the detainees provided helpful information to the detectives, shedding new light on the case and bringing them closer to the truth. He admitted to breaking into Fawn's house with a group of other boys and stealing some items. He described how they made their way to the second floor through the canopy and even revealed unknown details about the crime. According to him, when he threw a tape recorder out the window, its handles fell off. The boy hid it under a nearby bush, and the police found the item in that spot. It was a promising development, but the young man quickly retracted his statement and stopped cooperating with the investigation. Without his confession, the case had almost no chance of making it to court. The detectives were left wondering why the witnesses were so easily intimidated. Were they afraid of their safety, or was there something else at play? The case seemed to be at a standstill once again, and the detectives were left with more questions than answers. The case of Fawn Cox murder had gone cold for years until the police decided to reopen the investigation in the early 2000s. The first thing they did was upload DNA samples from the crime scene to the CODIS database, which had been created several years before and contained DNA samples from people tried for several crimes. But despite this new technological advancement, no matches were found for Fawn's killer. It was a disappointing setback for the detectives, who hoped this new DNA evidence would finally lead them to the truth. But the emergence of the database did allow the detectives to recollect DNA samples from the 3 original suspects and conduct more advanced tests. This time, experts unequivocally determined that the hair, semen, and blood found at the crime scene did not belong to any of them. It was a puzzling development, given that the suspects had been found possessing Fawn's belongings. The detectives speculated that the 3 boys had indeed broken into Fawn's house that night and stolen some items, but another man with them had abused and killed the girl. But who was he? And where was he now? This raised even more questions. Could it be that 4 criminals had entered the house unnoticed, killed Fawn, and just as unnoticed, left the crime scene? The detectives still had no answer to this question, and the case remained mysterious. For years, the case of Fawn Cox murder had been at a standstill, and the family had all but given up hope that the killer would ever be caught. They believed that the 3 original suspects had been involved in the crime and could potentially point to the killer, but they remained silent. The only hope for justice seemed to lie in a DNA sample stored in the police lab. But it wasn't until 2018 that a new lead emerged in the form of a post on a popular American forum for unsolved crimes. The post was written by Amber, Fawn's younger sister, and contained disturbing details about the crime that was unknown to the police. Amber's post had been verified and confirmed, and it quickly gained attention from the true crime community. She revealed that she had worked as a nanny during the week and was only at home during the day. But on weekends, she slept in the very room on the second floor through which the burglars had snuck in. If the criminals had entered the house that night, they would have been immediately spotted. Amber's post on the Unsolved Crimes forum had given the investigation into Fawn Cox murder a new lead, but it didn't bring them any closer to solving the case. The police were still at a loss as to who the real killer was and how they had avoided justice for so long. But in 2018, the science of DNA research had come a long way, and dozens, if not hundreds, of long-forgotten cases were being solved thanks to new analysis tools. Fawn's family couldn't understand why the police weren't in a hurry to reopen the investigation, especially given the advancements in DNA testing. They continued to talk to detectives about the case, but each time they were told the same thing. The extended DNA testing required money and that the police had dozens of cases to work on. The frustration of Fawn's family was palpable, and they were left waiting for their turn and for their funding to come in. They knew the keys to solving the case was new DNA testing, but they couldn't do it alone. Despite their frustration, Fawn's family refused to give up. In 2019, they decided to take the initiative and launch a fundraiser to cover the full cost of new DNA testing. They also offered a $10,000 reward for any information leading to the capture of Fawn's killers. Thanks to extensive media coverage of the case and numerous interviews given by the family, many people responded to their requests for help. The family quickly collected the necessary amount of money, but even then, they were met with disappointment. The police department refused to initiate a new investigation at the expense of the victims' relatives. The family was outraged. They couldn't understand why the police was so reluctant to solve the case, especially given the advancements in DNA testing and the new leads that had come to light. They knew that time was running out and were desperate for answers. The lead detective on the case explained that while he understood the family's frustration, a more prominent issue is at play. If the relatives of one victim were allowed to pay for DNA testing and expedite the results, then hundreds of other families who have been searching for years for the murder of their loved ones should have the same right. However, the reality is that only a few laboratories in the world conduct the kind of innovative DNA tests that could potentially solve cases like Fawn's. And with such a simultaneous influx of those wishing to do so, their resources are simply not enough. But the family of Fawn Cox was not going to give up. They had heard of Parabon Nanolabs, the leading company in DNA analysis, and their breakthroughs in finding relatives from small genetic samples to creating an approximate portrait of the owner of the DNA. This lab was the family's only hope in finally solving Fawn's murder. The lab had a track record of solving decade-old cases, and they hoped that Fawn's case would be no different. The family of Fawn Cox had been waiting for justice for over 3 decades, and they were convinced that the police were not doing enough to solve the case. They believed that their financial situation and their area had hindered the investigation. It was a frustrating and heart-wrenching experience for them. Unfortunately, they never managed to expedite the process, and it wasn't until late 2020 that the long-awaited breakthrough happened. But the family wasn't ready for that kind of truth. Then, in late 2020, the long-awaited breakthrough happened. The police had sent samples from Fawn's room to a lab, and after a detailed examination of the DNA, they finally found the person to whom it belonged: Fawn's own cousin, Donald Cox. The news was shocking, and the family was left reeling. No one had ever suspected Donald of being involved in Fawn's murder. At the time of her death, he was only 21 years old and had a history of trouble with the law, constantly behind bars for misdemeanors such as theft and drug possession. But even with all this new information, the family was still left with more questions than answers. Why had Donald killed Fawn? What could have driven him to commit such a heinous act? As the investigation continued, more details about Donald's life came to light. He had a troubled childhood with a history of violence and abuse. His troubled past had followed him into adulthood, and he had struggled with addiction for most of his life. However, Donald Cox died of an overdose in 2006, but the police investigated his death because certain circumstances seemed suspicious. Because of that investigation, a sample of his DNA had been preserved, but had never been entered into the FBI database because he was a victim, not a perpetrator. The discovery that Fawn Cox's cousin, Donald Cox, had committed the murder brought some closure to the family after 31 long years. The DNA evidence provided the conclusive proof they had been waiting for. But there was still one nagging question that remained unanswered. What about the 3 original suspects who had been in the house that night? They had been the focus of the investigation for years, and there was a great deal of evidence to suggest that they had been involved in the murder. Now, it was clear how they knew the house and the family's routine so well. Donald Cox had been a frequent visitor and knew all the nuances. But despite this new information, the police decided to close the case and not pursue charges against the 3 men. Fawn's sister saw no point in trying to get a confession out of them. After all, the family finally had the answers they had been waiting for. But for many, this decision by police left a bitter taste in their mouth. However, one important point in this story still needs to be addressed. 3 original suspects in the case had been present in the house on the night of the murder. While it was now clear how they knew the family's routines and the layout of the house, the police closed the case and did not file any new charges against them. Fawn's sister, Felicia, believed that they had already paid for their actions in the way that they were treated by the neighborhood and the damage it caused to their lives. The police had originally learned about the suspects from the family of one of them, who had noticed a stolen Nintendo set top box among his belongings. This information had been widely publicized, and the community treated the suspects negatively. It was impossible to prove their guilt, and the victim's family finally knew the killer's name. Donald had lived for 17 years without punishment for what he had done. He had communicated with his family during this time, but eventually succumbed to his addiction to illegal substances, which drove him to his grave. The case had finally been solved, But the family would never forget the pain and heartache they had endured for over 3 decades. The story of Fawn Cox's murder is a tragic reminder that justice is not always swift and that sometimes it takes years or even decades for the truth to come to light. It is also a reminder of the importance of advances in DNA analysis and the determination of families to seek justice for their loved ones. What are your thoughts on the case of Fawn Cox? Do you believe justice was served? Are there any other cases that you think could benefit from advances in DNA analysis? We want to hear from you, so please leave a comment below and share your thoughts. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more true crime stories like this. Thank you for watching.